everyone, and welcome to another episode of At War, the podcast by the Conflict Law Center. Today, we are very, very happy to be joined by Samuel Moyn, who is Chancellor Kent Professor of Law and History at Yale University. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I always say that the two most important books that kind of totally shifted my thinking was The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein and then Not Enough by you, which really pushed me to think about human rights completely differently to how I had before. So it's really a pleasure to be meeting you like this.
Well, it's a privilege.
So I wanted to start off by asking you about the student protests across American college campuses, which I'm sure you've been very much, you can't get away from it. And the state's response, which is being watched by the rest of the world, especially us in the global south, with a fair amount of horror. Is this the failure of liberalism that Deneen warned us about?
Well, I would say that the protests have been inspirational, and only rarely has the state directly been involved, and then only on invitation of school administrators. So the protests are, more about liberals who run universities than about Joe Biden, who has
Okay.
other, objections leveled at him, like his much more direct implication in Israel's war than universities, which have been challenged for their investment practices. Um, and overall, I think the student revolt has been, impressive and taught us that American attitudes, especially among youth towards Israel-Palestine, have undergone a big shift. And that means that we're really at the beginning of something, given that my country remains Israel's staunchest supporter in the international system. And as of a few days ago, there are even, limits that Joe Biden seems to finally be placing on Israel's room for maneuver. So the question, I guess, is what any of it has to do with liberalism.
Yeah.
Patrick Deneen is a right-wing commentator who said that liberalism's failed by succeeding. And there are various elements to how he thinks about liberalism and how like what its forms are. I would say that this event brought out maybe the authoritarian sides of liberalism, which he does complain about,
Yeah.
especially when he thinks liberals assault religious forces.
Mm.
Here, the left is in position, which it has been very regularly in modern history, of seeing how repressive liberals can be towards emancipatory forces. Um, and that was true in many instances, maybe most famously in 1848, when liberals initially joined the revolt against monarchs, but then very quickly switched sides and joined the forces of order and repression, and it was bloody. Now, this case hasn't been as involved as much carnage, but I think I would say less Deneen's diagnosis than this very big worry that many of us on the left have, that liberals are inconsistent friends, or maybe not friends at all at the end of the day of emancipation, and
Yeah.
generally throw in their lot with order. So that's, I think, how many of us have emerged from these recent events and thinking about liberalism, if they have.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to hear from the student protesters. So many of them, I think, in their interviews have been talking about the fact that this is the most they felt part of a community the entire time that they've been at college. And I thought that harkens back so much to Deneen talking about how liberalism
Yes.
erodes that sense of society and that sense of you being a part of something. And I thought it was very interesting that so many of them mentioned that.
I like that point. I wrote a review of Deneen saying that it wasn't clear it was liberalism that failed
Mm.
so much as neoliberalism.
Yeah, right.
And I do think that something failed for the students, because you're right that they do feel that the current order, especially the kind of meritocratic and neoliberal one in which they're being raised, is not soulful for them. It atomizes them rather than
Yeah.
brings them together. And as you say, it's been remarkable that when they've challenged authority, they've found solidarity amongst one another, quite apart from their cause. Like it gave them a whole different way of thinking about togetherness than they've had, in the meritocratic trenches of and competitive trenches of their, lives to date.
And I think it's really interesting. I was watching an interview with Mearsheimer very recently, and he said that liberalism seems to have a crusader impulse baked into it. So before you had Christianity be the evangelical thing that you're trying to spread,
Yes,
and now you have liberalism. And I think to
yes,
go back to your book, Liberalism Against Itself, you do look at the Cold War liberals and look at it almost seems to me, we say that the laws of war are the vanishing point of international law. And it almost seems like Zionism is the vanishing point of liberalism for them. Because everything that was otherwise okay or anything that they held dear was put to the side when it came to Zionism. And I think it's very interesting to look at it the way you do in the book through their Jewish ancestry or their cultural Jewishness and how that gave rise to this support for Zionism.
yeah. In the book, I confronted a kind of an old saw about Cold War liberals, that the fact that they were so disproportionately Jewish was because they were especially sensitive to how states can victimize people, especially minorities.
Yeah.
Um, and I didn't think the evidence for that proposition really checked out. I mean, it's true that a number of the characters in my book, like Isaiah Berlin or Judah Sklar, were migrants or refugees. Sklar was a refugee, um, but they didn't talk much about the Holocaust in particular.
Okay.
And they did refer some to state violence, but they had in mind, Berlin especially, the kind of violence of the Soviet state, which he didn't experience personally, but and it's totally fair, even if you don't experience something personally, to be concerned about it. But what I noticed is that many of these same people, while they said nothing about Judaism as a religion, and they actually didn't refer to Jewish experience
Mm.
in their time as motivating their views. They did talk a fair bit about Israel, and what was interesting there is that, as you said, many of them, like Isaiah Berlin, or another example would be an Israeli named Jacob or Yaakov Talmon. They were willing to suspend their Cold War liberalism when it came to Zionism. They abhorred states and violence, especially revolutionary violence,
Yeah.
but they were willing to not even give Israel a pass. They celebrated
Right.
Israel. And so the notion was that it was like a last gasp of an older liberalism that they embraced, even in rejecting it, uh, in general. And that was especially glaring, I thought, because um, they rejected, in particular, decolonizing states and decolonizing violence. But of course, Israel and its defense involves a lot of violence too, which
Yeah.
they embrace. So it seemed like a kind of glaring contradiction that we have to reckon with.
And do you think we're still reckoning with that in the sense of what we're seeing now? So you have there perhaps it was their Jewishness wasn't formative for them, but they put it aside when it came to Israel on the basis of ethno-nationalism, which I guess maybe being from Pakistan as well, I don't have an issue for that being the basis of a state itself, but
Right.
I have an issue with what it means for other people when that's the basis of
Yeah.
being
Yeah.
part of the state. And that's also, I mean, it is shocking to look at from here because we're now seeing how heavily propagandized the West is, but in the sense that you can hold on to that liberalist impulse and kind of negate anything China and Russia are doing on the basis of authoritarianism. But the view from here is authoritarianism doesn't look that bad when this is what liberalism then means, which is a big hole of impunity for Israel.
Yeah. So those are really good thoughts. I mean, I obviously it's not accidental that this one exceptional, nation that these Cold War liberals happen to back, even as they are blind to or, you know, critical of decolonization, is Israel, because
Mhm.
I would argue it is a form of ethno-nationalism. What's interesting is it's not as if these figures, most of them, cared a lot about Jewishness in any other form
Right.
than this one. So it's almost like Zionism became their last tether to a Jewish identity, which they were
Mhm.
otherwise abandoning in many cases.
Right.
Um, and a great example of that, not to get into detail, is the person I write about in the last chapter of the book, named Lionel Trilling, a Columbia University literary critic who, among other things, was Edward Said's mentor.
Oh,
And it's very interesting that Trilling is very repudiates completely his Jewish identity and was very critical of Zionism in his youth, but by his middle age, he embraced Zionism, and so he, in a sense, shows in a really clear way this dynamic. But I would agree with you that today we see just the glaring contradiction of Cold War liberalism in America's policy in general. I mean, it's amazing to watch Joe Biden give a very heartfelt speech about anti Semitism and the Holocaust without recognizing who the victims are today. I mean, it's totally fine, I think, to say Jews can still be victims. And there was October 7th, and he's registering that fact, but then to just ignore his own complicity, like very
yeah,
personal complicity in the death of many more people. And it's not, as if the kinds of things that have been visited on Jews in world history are not being visited on another group of people he cares nothing about
yeah, yeah,
today, aside from promising that he'll make the war that Israel has been fighting more humane for their sake, which anticipates some of your other
yeah,
questions. So I agree with you that the Cold War liberal, um, let's say, selectivity is back, and the same people who complain endlessly about the looming threat of totalitarianism in so many places, China, Russia, Trump, um, are backing or see no problem in Israel's violence, and this doesn't make sense because either you should be against both or for,
yeah.
I mean, for both, but being against one and for the other makes no sense.
Yeah, and I think it's very interesting that this comes so hot on the heels of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, because then the asimilar, like the complete dissimilarity in the way we're treating this is just so glaring.
It is. I wrote a cover story for the UK magazine Prospect right after October 7th, and I complained about the Joe Biden's analogy
Mm,
of Ukraine and Israel and as both victims of anti-democratic terror, basically. And he leaned very hard on that analogy in his initial kind of explanation of support for Israel after October 7th. And
right.
it's just an astounding comparison to make because it's faulty on so many levels.
Mm,
And yet, for a long time, Biden really presented it as the kind of centerpiece of the way he was thinking as he engaged America in these two big wars.
yeah, yeah. And I think perhaps we see a critique of liberalism from the Christian right and the Christian left, but I think because religion has had to recede so much from the foreground of perhaps
Yes.
academia, and there's not a theological doctrinal debate about who are like what anti-Semitism would mean. And I always think about it in terms of we're talking in international law, being an international lawyer, I
Yeah.
only think about nation states. It's like a very that's my unit. I only think about it in
Yes.
those terms. But the common feeling here is that uh, the anti-Semitism actually exists in the West, and they put that guilt on us. And that, okay, we might have, some issues in our scripture too, in terms of what it says about other faiths, but generally because we're the last one, we revere everyone. It's not baked into our religion, and I find
Right.
that's something that we don't engage with enough in terms of what it means to be anti-Semitic. It's not a theological debate, and I think it kind of that's just left out of it entirely.
Agreed. That's really interesting, and it you could take it in so many directions because, in a way, one big form of anti-Semitism is in a kind of transmuted American form as philosemitism, which is
Yeah,
not,
yeah,
exactly the opposite of
yeah,
anti-Semitism, but sometimes anti-Semitism in a different form, because
yeah, yeah,
evangelical Christian support for Israel is part of this very scary millennialist end
yeah,
times thinking. And it's not like they like Israel or let alone Jews as such. It's more part of this Christian geopolitics, but it's absolutely central to the right wing support for
yeah.
Israel. And it's not talked about, in part because it's useful for liberals, and for that matter, Jews who support Israel, to have these friends on their side,
Yeah,
whatever the reasons they might have,
yeah.
which are disturbing for their own politics.
Yeah, and it even checks out historically, because even though the Crusades were Christians versus Muslims, they didn't get that far. And then they were just like, well, these are the people who killed Christ, so we should kill, and they killed Jews in far greater numbers than Muslims
Of
were killing.
course.
So
Oh,
yeah,
for sure. I mean, the Christian roots of anti-Semitism are just profound.
yeah,
And as you know, I mean, Jews lived, not without problems, but in general, you know, uh, comedy in many Muslim states, and that had a very strong basis for centuries. And actually, it was the rise of Zionism and Israel which caused that to end in a certain way, with the expulsion of many Jews from Mediterranean, Muslim majority countries.
yeah,
So, like,
yeah.
the current Middle Eastern politics is not something that you can just extrapolate from the Quran or something like that. It's the opposite. It's all caused by 20th century history.
Yeah, and I think that's why the existence of Palestinian Christians and the fact that they didn't sell out the
Right.
Muslim Palestinians, whereas I was reading in Ilan Pape's book that the Druze really did, and the Christians were offered
Yeah.
that. They were offered
Yeah.
that someone would like, we won't do anything to you, and they refused. They were like, no, we're Palestinian. We're going to stand with them, and their
Yeah.
existence is really written out of the story because it just doesn't fit into the narrative.
It's really interesting, and it's part of a broader story of Middle Eastern Christians, and that would be true in Lebanon, many other places, and they sometimes they do side with Western projects like Lebanese Christians in the Cold War, but
Yeah,
other times, like Edward Said, comes from a Palestinian Christian
yeah.
family. There's a very different politics chosen, and general solidarity with one's kind of national group rather than one's co-religionist globally.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I think I want to move on also to one. I think one of the things that most frustrates me is the sentence, the IDF is the most moral army in the world. And I think
Right.
when I teach war law to my students, I always quote your argument that the ICRC believed making war more humane would lead to its abolition, whereas Tolstoy
Yes.
agreed he thought it would just make it more acceptable. And I always
Right.
ask them who they agree with. They always agree with you and Tolstoy. But I keep
Right.
going back to something you wrote at the beginning of your book, Humane, that absolutely and relatively fewer captives are mistreated and fewer civilians die by far than in the past. Maybe I'm just trying to justify my own job here, but is that not reason enough to humanize war?
Sure. I mean, taken all by itself and everything else being equal, I'm for IHL, International Humanitarian Law, humanizing war, because it's better than the alternative. And some of the concerns that various people, including Tolstoy at one point, have raised don't make a lot of sense to me, like the idea that humane war would automatically last longer or
Mm.
um, like lead to more frequent war. It's not obvious that it's the case. I mean, I think I've tried to argue more modestly that not that we should be against humanizing war, but that we should beware of the collateral effects of doing so, because certain states can then try at least to claim more legitimacy for their wars, and Israel is a classic case. What's interesting about this, current debate is that where America, I think, under Barack Obama, kind of succeeded in getting that legitimacy,
Mm.
when Obama said, "Not to worry, I'm continuing the war, but it will not be the same as before, and it will be less brutal."
Yeah,
That worked for him, but it's not working for Israel to say, "We're following the law, we've lawyered up," which they have.
yeah.
We're checking every strike for its compliance with relevant norms. That doesn't seem to satisfy a lot of people, including Joe Biden himself.
Yeah, yeah. And I think Israeli journalists we have so much to be grateful to for them, because
Yes,
without them we would not know that you literally have an algorithm called "Where's Daddy" to take them out when
yes,
they enter their house and not when they're in a military target. But it also, to me, seems like there's so many gray areas that calling out a war crime, there are so many excuses that you can give. And I think I've never been more critical of this area than I have now. I've always been like, okay, we need to change the
yes,
veto, but the Geneva Conventions are a very inspiring document. You've agreed, not giving a POW his tobacco ration is a violation. But I think Humane really put it to me that you've written in so much gray area that really you can excuse so much conduct, and we're seeing that play out so much.
I'm totally with you. So I mean, we've agreed that it's not a bad thing, but it's a very modest good.
Yeah,
And it is interesting that at least some argument about the war has come from people who don't fully grasp how permissive international humanitarian
yeah,
law is. After all, it is a body of law that permits not only killing, but intentional killing of civilians,
yeah,
at least in some number. And so it's also a body of law that, just by its very nature, I mean, is mostly treaty law, uh, is there's a role for states to make claims about how they interpret it, including Israel. I mean, that's the system, that not just that states are supposed to lawyer up when they're making the calls about who to kill, how many,
mm,
but after the fact, they can reach their own conclusions, or at least try to, about how permissive the norms really are. And
yeah,
then in very few cases can we say that something was clearly wrong. That's why the International Criminal Court, when it issues its warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and others, will probably focus on starvation,
yeah,
not civilian killing through strikes, because those are so fact dependent. And Israel is going to have some case to make about why its lawyers concluded what they did. So it's an area which I think is morally so murky.
yeah.
Um, Not that it's bad, but that we should just recognize how ambiguous and, in a way, tragic it is that we would be forced into arguing against a brutal state, that its brutality just went a little too far this time.
Yeah, yeah. And I think um, even when it comes to looking at their motivations for the war is to eradicate Hamas, it can't be. It has to be to defeat Hamas, right? That is
Right,
the
right.
only legitimate kind of military objective that we accept. Hamas is a political group. You can't eradicate a political group, in my
Exactly.
opinion, when you read the laws of war. And also the fact that war crimes were committed on October 7th, but it doesn't take you away from the fact that Hamas is potentially a resistance movement. The ICC arrest warrants against Hamas are also to be very much welcomed. And I think the fact that they're so scared about them being issued against Netanyahu, you're ignoring the fact that they're also going to be issued
Right,
against Hamas. And the
right.
whole, I mean, terrorism is such a murky, it's such a, it changed the law so fundamentally. And I thought it was really interesting in your book when you talk about how even very clear-sighted people after 9/11, including Richard Falk, they did believe that we should go into the war, sans attribution at all between the Taliban and Al Qaeda. And yet, when it comes to other states, no other states are allowed that leeway of claiming something as being self-defense and changing the law as a result. And we just saw that with Iran and Israel. So I feel like the when you quote that international law is less a fig leaf than a see-through garment, I felt like that was that was very, very apparent today, and especially in the role that international lawyers play.
I'm totally with you. You know, unlike a lot of people who are in a way running, I think, let's call them premature and understandable victory laps around the uses of international law in this conflict, or in general, I remain skeptical because I've just seen
Yeah.
where it fails and how it legitimates uh, the powerful. And there, I think we need to be wary of it for a lot of the reasons you mentioned. Now that doesn't mean that there aren't some features of it to lean on. I mean, I would have said that this conflict again vindicates the worry that if we focus, let's say, too exclusively on how war is conducted, we ignore the parts of the law that are about kind of the rights and wrongs of the existence of the conflict. And of course, you know, the war aim of eliminating Hamas can't be relevant to any calculus in the conduct of hostilities, like for a particular strike.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
war aim that Israel announced is what international lawyers like us would call a jus ad bellum
Yeah.
rationale, and yet, you know, there is jus ad bellum proportionality, and as you know, people we probably both know, like Adil Haq, have argued, um, you know, maybe there are some criticisms to make of Israel's um, resort to force, and that's to leave aside the very big arguments that we make about the fact that while Hamas might be a non-state actor, Gaza is not a state.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and so it seems like it's occupied territory,
Mm.
and then there, you know, the international legal consequences are potentially, worth pondering. So I mean that's, you know, one big area, but I'm kind of in agreement with you that at the end of the day, notwithstanding the International Court of Justice's provisional measures on genocide, I don't think we should get ahead of ourselves in, crediting international law yet with making a big difference
Okay.
in this conflict. I mean, I do think it's shown how it can be used as a tool to stigmatize a powerful state.
Yeah.
But historically, it's mainly been a tool to buttress the legitimacy and achieve the ends that powerful states want to achieve. So we have to figure out, you know, at the end of the day, how to balance these two facts.
Yeah. Were you in favor then of South Africa bringing the case before the ICJ?
Um, sure. I mean, I think to me it was, incredibly ironic because the 1966 ICJ case in
Mm.
which basically the court failed to do much about apartheid, which, on the basis of um, the mandate that South Africa at that time held over what's now Namibia, kind
Yeah.
of depressed international lawyers for a generation
Okay.
about the uses of international law. And
Mhm.
it's just an incredible irony that all of these years later, it's South Africa that is kind of reanimating the ICJ or helping. And I guess, the basic thing to say about that case is that it's for jurisdictional reasons, that it made sense. I mean, it may not have made sense on substance, and maybe South Africa won't prevail in the case in the long run,
Yeah.
because it's just really hard to prove that
Yeah.
anyone's genocidal given the intent requirement. But when we look out, the ICC was being comparatively slow moving, although rapid for that institution. There's no way to, there's nowhere to go for these use of force arguments. Like, we can make them as scholars, but there's no
Yeah.
venue to enforce the UN Charter against either a permanent member of the Security Council or a state that one of those states is protecting, as in this case.
Yeah.
And so, like, it was a choice out of a lack of options to use the ICJ on the genocide convention's provisions, just because it was possible at all.
Yeah, and everyone gets so annoyed with me when I'm like, I don't know whether they're gonna win on the merits, but and again, the irony is from Nuremberg that there you had everyone say this is the most important international crime because everything then flows from the act of aggression itself, and yet you didn't have
Correct.
anything until 2017. You had the Kampala Amendment come into force, so you're like, okay, the states deprioritized this for a reason, and international law didn't really manage to force them to take it that
That's
seriously.
right. I mean, that's a really excellent point, and I've tried to make it too, and it's you could even go further because the amendments basically make it almost impossible that aggression will ever be charged, and so we're dealing with a situation where after the invasion of Ukraine, a lot of people who sponsored the Iraq War
Yeah,
call for an ad hoc tribunal like Nuremberg around
yeah,
Vladimir Putin's aggression, but don't ever question Western aggression or that of our clients. And the ICC is powerless uh,
mm,
for jurisdictional reasons. So it's almost like planned irrelevance. And that is remarkable because it wasn't genocide, a
yeah,
concept mentioned only a couple of times at Nuremberg, but aggression that was the crime of crimes in the 40s. And things got reversed, which then set up a reality today where we like try to deal with Israel's like aggression,
mm,
the turpitude of its war as such, through focusing on how it's fighting that war, including the possibility that it became genocidal.
yeah, yeah. And I think there are so many different views to this that, yeah, they have the right to self-defense, but it's disproportionate. Pakistan actually argues that they don't have the right to self-defense in occupied territory, and that comes from a
Well,
very,
exactly. I mean, if it's not a state, then there's no armed attack by a state
yeah,
actor. And if if it's an armed attack by a non-state actor that's on its own territory, well, that has no bearing
mm,
on self-defense under international law. Uh, Now, it might be that Israel has some recourse because
mm,
it's dealing with a kind of armed group operating on its own
yeah,
territory. Um, but that doesn't give it carte blanche.
yeah,
And so the claims that especially my country's president Joe Biden have made around self-defense, as if, well, Israel has it and it just gives it a free hand,
yeah,
really do resemble the claims that the United States has made about self-defense, which is it's almost like it's a permission slip rather than a prohibition
yeah,
now, that you claim you have it and it's not a limit on your activity. It's like
yeah,
opens the gate
completely.
to anything,
Yeah.
endless war, balanced maybe by some concerns about how the war is prosecuted.
Yeah, and I think then the argument is that they only have the right to use force under the law of occupation, which is a much narrower.
Absolutely,
Yeah,
absolutely. That's right. That's right. I mean, it would be occupied territory or it would be its own territory. I mean, um, but yeah, um, there'd be constraints in the laws of war around
mm,
what you can do on occupied territory. Now, it might be that you can do a lot because those are going to be themselves um, rules having to do with necessity and proportionality. So, in a sense, they might be very similar to the constraints allegedly an international law, but I
Mm.
think more people would agree that the law of occupation involves such constraints. And of course, then there are protected objects like hospitals and so forth, and schools, universities.
Yeah, and I think it's quite surprising that 7 months later we still don't know what happened really on October 7th. And there is now so much, I don't even want to get into the question of what happened on October 7th because it's such a debated issue, and especially the use of sexual violence in terms of against women and what that has meant for both sides. Because I mean, I'm very wary whenever anyone mentions women's rights as a
Yeah,
pretext for military intervention.
absolutely.
Is already something which sends off massive alarm signals. But the fact that you still haven't had the UN go in and do those fact-finding missions to the extent that you would be able to believe that evidence, and yet you're
Right,
almost anti-feminist for not
right.
supporting a military assault on that basis.
I'm with you. I think we should be very wary. I mean, feminism is obviously the most noble cause, given that patriarchy is really the most endemic form of subordination in world history to date. However, as Karen Engel and others have argued, it's been abused and militarized by great powers in recent decades. And like the Afghanistan case is an
Yeah,
excellent example. At the same time, we know that like war involves rapine. Like that's very central to it from its depiction in Homer's The Iliad onward, World
yeah,
War II. And it's been revolutionary in our time that sexual violence has been um, taken seriously as something to care about at all in general, but especially in these wartime settings. So I don't think we can reach any, simple-minded conclusion like none happened.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
because but there's also atrocity propaganda, as a
yes,
famous
yeah,
feature of the history of war. So I don't know, because as you say, we haven't had adequate, trustworthy, neutral arbiters kind of tell us what happened to the extent we can know. And
mm,
I would assume the likely um, answer is going to be there was some. Does
yeah,
that provide, authority for a state to kill 40,000
exactly.
innocent people
Yeah.
in response? Absolutely not. So,
Yeah, and I wonder also about the brutality of patriarchy as well. Perhaps coming from this part of the world as well, it's like, okay, you're saving brown Muslim women from horrible brown Muslim men. And I think they're also the women who get attention from the West are the ones who are going against their men. And I do like that the early Me Too movement had these African American feminists going like, "Don't come for our men" under this. And I
right,
and I feel that a little bit as well when it comes here because the post 9/11, especially, we didn't have what you had before that was this emasculated man who could not talk to women. You had this bearded, very patriarchal, wants to have four wives, is gonna, beat them up if he doesn't. And it's like, okay, neither of those are okay. We don't want either
right.
of those to represent our men.
Yeah, no, I mean, that all sounds really compelling. I mean, I guess I would say that um, the, there are some things from history to keep in mind as we confront these current realities. One is that, you know, one of the great feminist causes for a long time was peace. Um, and without women's participation, as I try to show in the book Humane, there
Mm,
there would be no UN charter, because really states were forced to take seriously women's demands for, like, stopping wars, or at least having fewer, and because, notwithstanding the things we remember about war,
mm,
you know the the main people for a long time who died in war were soldiers in the tens of millions, and
Yeah.
that was the sons, husbands, and brothers of many
Yeah.
women who found that the most appalling thing. But at the same time, this was in its origins a white woman's cause. And only in the latter half of the 20th century have we seen a real challenge to, what one author, Rafia Zakaria, calls, white feminism.
Yeah.
And so that is something that I think is still being argued about, and we haven't really seen a kind of bigger coalition and a global feminism in the wartime context that really, can balance peace and the various concerns with brutality we might have in this kind of situation.
Yeah. Now, final question, because I know you also have to leave. Do you think that as horrible as the Israel-Palestine war has been and the way it's kind of shifted the mentality of people like globally, do you think it's going to get us closer to the abolition of war entirely?
Well, I guess, it's you can't say anything's heartening about such a situation, but I guess I'll say that while I did feel a somewhat vindicated by how centrally um, just the conduct of hostilities have become to the
Mm,
kind of global debate about
mm,
the war. Um, at the same time, the thing I worried about when Americans were doing it, as I said earlier, don't seem as, concerning. Israel has definitely tried to follow Obama and say, well, we're fighting in compliance with the laws of war. What could be wrong with our war? In fact, it's
mm.
noble and just. Um, and that's been rejected. Now, there are a lot of reasons for thinking that this is an exceptional moment when um, there's just a concern for this war and a skepticism about this state. And we could say a lot about that. But in the end, what impresses me is the more depressing conclusion that we have so few tools for constraining states,
Mm.
not when it comes to the conduct of hostilities where the tools are real, but when it comes to their starting and continuing wars.
Right.
And that is, that's again something that I think many of us who started to complain about the war on terror should feel vindicated by, because Israel, in a sense, invented the idea of humane war and contributed to the possibility of a war on terror, since it was fighting one in a sense long before the United States. But at the same time, in this war, it seems like, though it's not over, it's like another version, a bigger version of it, what Israelis have called mowing the lawn,
Mm.
which is the idea that every so often deterrence has to be restored. Some
Yeah.
Palestinians have to be killed to show who's boss, and nothing changes.
Mm.
Um, and we don't have good tools to focus on the political dispute and bring it to resolution. And that's the failure of international law. And it doesn't seem like this war is changing that and giving us hopes that it will play some different role anytime soon.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I agree with that. I also think that the only thing that gives me hope is perhaps that it's been 7 months and we are still talking about this
Yes,
and all eyes are still on Gaza. And I think that in an age
that's true.
of social media and attention, just like our attention spans being so tiny, it means people are still so invested and are learning
Yes.
this conflict for the first time, me included. I don't think I've read so much about this conflict before.
I love that point. I mean, it is that is heartening. First of all, I mean, there have been global South coalitions before against Western wars or those of their clients, and
Yeah.
what is, I think, uplifting is that in this case, it's not just that the perceptions have remained stable, and no wonder given that the war's been so brutal for so long, but in the transatlantic space, far from being ignored, the global South's views are being affirmed by youth.
Yeah.
And this is new. And it really represents a big change in the framing of wars in recent memory. And so that's the beginning of something very potentially revolutionary, given generational change. And we'll just have to see where it goes. So I agree with you. There's a lot of reasons to think that this is a pivotal, transformative moment.
Yeah, we hope so. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you
Thank you
so
for
much,
having
everyone,
me.
for watching us at home. We hope you'll tune in to the next few episodes as well.